In this video, I'm going to be discussing paracellular and transcellular hyperpermeability and talking about the difference between those two and why it's very important to differentiate them in clinical practice when we are working with intestinal permeability in autoimmune disease. So first up, when you have a look at the gut wall, the tight junctions in the gut wall, of course, you can see that the epithelial cells themselves are bound together by tight junctions which are regulated by membrane proteins or regulation proteins. So paracellular permeability involves the tight junctions. It is what we think of when we think about intestinal permeability, where the tight junctions themselves have created space between the epithelial cells, and that allows for larger molecules and undigested food and bacterial debris and anything else that's found in the guts to cross between the cells and into the lamina propria there. So that's paracellular permeability. But transcellular permeability is where the antigen, the protein actually the molecule travels through the interior of the cell itself. So paracellular permeability involves the zonulin pathway, and it is characterized by the breakdown of intestinal tight junctions. So paracellular permeability is associated with mild levels of inflammation, with oxidative stress, with zonulin release, because zonulin is the enzyme that communicates the need for opening and closing the space between in the tight junctions there, and intestinal permeability. But transcellular permeability, when there is debris that is passing or molecules that are passing through the interior of the cell, this actually involves intestinal destruction or damage or injury. It involves severe inflammation. It involves intestinal damage, and it is not associated with zonulin. So transcellular permeability is a different clinical scenario. It's much worse. It means that you have a highly oxidized, oxidatively stressed, if that's a phrase that I can use, inflammatory, destructive process that's going on in the intestines. With paracellular, you can break it down with many things. A little bit of elevated HbA1c, oxidative stress, inflammation, and tight junction proteins will open. But the tight junction proteins are very vulnerable or responsive to signals from the environment in the gut. But with transcellular permeability, it requires injury of some description. And it is critical to know the difference. Sorry. So with transcellular permeability, there are only three. So with Cyrex-RE2, where we're measuring the difference between transcellular and paracellular permeability, with paracellular permeability, the markers that are going to come up positive on Cyrex-RE2 are occludin and zonulin, because we're looking at antibodies to the proteins that regulate the tight junctions. But when you see actomyosin elevated on RE2, we know we're dealing with transcellular permeability. And there are only three variables that will cause actomyosin antibodies to be measurable in serum, and those are significant infection. We're not talking about dysbiosis, we're talking about an infectious environment in the gut that is causing damage to the gut wall, where the epithelial cell itself is becoming damaged. Undiagnosed celiac disease or GI autoimmunity, non-specified or non-celiac GI autoimmunity. So when you have transcellular permeability measured, this requires further investigation into the underlying cause, because you're not dealing with leaky gut, sort of garden variety leaky gut, where you can use some glutamine and, kind of heal the gut with the normal protocols that we've all been taught, and then everything will be fine. So you need to be considering something like RA5, where you're looking to investigate further the underlying causes of the damage. So with RA5, we're looking at 24 tissue antibodies to see if we can identify subclinical or early stage 1, stage 2 autoimmunity, where there's inflammation and destruction to the gut wall itself from autoimmune disease. We need to be thinking about RA12, where we're looking at infection we need to be thinking about potentially RA3, where we're looking at gluten reactivity and some of the celiac markers, transglutaminase 2, for example. But you also need to be considering personalised conventional and functional testing, for example, calprotectin or celiac testing via the GP. We also want to be considering, of course, signs and symptoms and, personalised assessment of the person that you're working with to see what might be causing that level of damage to the guts. Transcellular permeability is just a different stage. It's a different clinical scenario, and it requires a different thinking about the case and different interventions. Oops. So knowing the difference, knowing whether or not you're dealing with transcellular or paracellular permeability, of course, changes the protocol type and duration. It changes the thinking of the case, it changes prioritization of clinical interventions, and it helps to determine the need for further laboratory investigation. So the other thing, of course, that's incredibly important to understand is that you must never assume that there is permeability with, even with diagnosed autoimmunity. You can't assume that there is gut permeability of any kind, but if you feel confident that there is gut permeability for any reason, if it's shown up on another test, for example, you still can't assume that you know that it is tight junction permeability. You really need to assess and make sure that there isn't a more serious degree of permeability present in the person that you're working with. So that is paracellular versus transcellular hyperpermeability. They are different, and it's important to understand the difference. Next up, we are going to be doing a bit of a deeper dive into zonulin and everything you need to know about working with zonulin in clinical practice. Thank you for your attention.